Baruch Hashem. Today's Yomi is Zevachim Kuf Yudala, but we're going to start on the bottom of Kuf Yud Gimel on the base 113b at the very bottom. At the Talmud, we're going to start around 8 lines from the bottom. The Gemara is discussing the concept of the Sayir Mishtaleach. We've been discussing that under certain sacrifices, if you bring them outside the temple, you are going to get a liability of kares, a punishment of kares. But the Sayir Mishtaleach, the goat that was sent out to Azazel, if you bring it outside the temple, you do not get kares. And the Gemara says, what the Mishnah said, the reason is because it says, about the verse, it says, Val Pesach o Moed lo hiviu. If you do not bring the korban to the Ol Moed, to the temple, then you're going to be liable. But the Sarah Mishalech was not supposed to be brought to the temple, so therefore you don't have this liability. But the Gemara challenges this because there's a different source for this idea. Because for Amini, we have a brisa. It says, O korban, and it refers to a korban that you did not bring to the base of Mikdash, and therefore you're going to be liable. And so in that context, it says, in that same pasuk, it says, Shomei Ani. I might think that this pasuk also refers to somebody who brings a kache bedek habayis. If he brings an animal that was consecrated for its value, for its monetary value to the temple, I might think that you also have this liability, shenikru korban, because it's also called a korban, as it states in the pasuk, v'nakreves korban Hashem. Talmud Omer val Pesach Al Moed. So the verse says, if he did not bring it to the entrance to the Ol Moed, which means to say, Mishra Ro'el Avoba Ol Moed. Where do you have liability for what's called Shlitas Chutz? Where do you have liability for slaughtering something outside the temple? That's if something was supposed to be brought to the Ol Moed. But Yatsu Kache Bedek Habayis, but this comes to exclude the Kache Bedek Habayis, the consecrated animals, the animals consecrated for the value, She'enan Ru'uyin. They were not ra'oi, they're not worthy to be brought into the temple, and so therefore you do not have the liability of kares for shlitas chutz. I might also think, says the Brisa, otzias elu she'enan ra'uyin lo otzias sayir mishtalech. I might think that sayir mishtalech you have liability. Shehu ra'oi lavo pesach hamoed. You might have thought that the sayir mishtalech you will be liable because it is something that is supposed to be brought to the Ol Moed, Tam Omer, La Hashem. And so we learn in the pasuk it says La Hashem, Mahotzi Sayir Mishtaleach She'enu Miyuchad La Hashem. Comes to exclude the case of Sayir Mishtaleach, the go for Azazel, because that is not Miyuchad La Hashem, and so therefore you're not going to be liable for Shlitas Chutz. We're in the bottom of 113b, around 4 lines from the bottom. And we have a contradiction because our Mishnah says that the source that is Sarah Mishalach is excluded from Shlitas Chutz is from the Pasach al Pasach al Moed lo Hiviu. But our Brisa here says that the source is from the word in that Pasach that is La Hashem, Korban La Hashem. So how do we deal with this contradiction? So the Gemara says, Lokasha, kan kodem hagrala, kan la'achar hagrala. One is before the lots were taken on these two goats to designate one for Azazel. At that point, it's and one is after the lots were taken. So before the lots were taken, it's excluded from the concept of La Hashem. But after the lots were taken, it's going to be excluded because it's no longer royal of La Hashem. And so that's the Gemara's assumption. So the Gemara says, but wait. Even after the lots were taken, you still have to take it to the Ol Moed to do a confession on the animal. So the Gemara says, okay, money, well, kasha kan kodem vidoy kan lachar vidoy. No, it refers to one is before the confession and one is after you make the confession. After the confession, it's no longer worthy to come to the Ol Moed, but before the confession, it's excluded. The goat that was possibly designated for Azazel is excluded from the verse La Hashem. Okay, so therefore the Shlitas Chutz doesn't apply to it. We also said in the Mishnah that there's a bunch of categories of animals that are excluded from Shlitas Chutz, from the prohibition of kares, because it says Lifnei Mishkan Hashem, that they have to be worthy to be brought before the Mishkan Hashem, and including in those are the animals of Roveav and Nirva. These are animals that engage in a sexual sin with the human being. So Roveav and Nirva is excluded because of the verse Lifnei Kriv Karban Hashem Lifnei Mishkan Hashem. Gemara says, "V'hanami typically mi pesach or moed lo savil." Why don't they also exclude this from the pesach or moed lo savil? That it's not once the animal is engaged in sexual sin, not worthy to be brought as a korban anymore. So therefore, it should be excluded from the prohibition of shlichas chutz. Why isn't it excluded from that? Why isn't that verse cited? Why is a verse cited with me mishkan Hashem? So the Gemara says, well, let's break it down on top of 114a. Bishlama rovea v'nirba. I understand if it was a sexual sin. I understand why it's going to be excluded. Mishkacha. So I understand why we don't cite the verse al Pesach or Moed, but we do cite the verse Lifnei Mishkan Hashem. Mishkacha leidak teshinu meikara. V'hada ravo. That we could be talking about a scenario where you consecrated it, and when you consecrated it, it was worthy to come to the Ol Moed, and then you committed the sexual sin. The person committed sexual sin with a kachim animal. So there, it's excluded since when you was consecrated, it was al Pesach, it was roy level Pesach Moed. So therefore, that can't be excluded from shlitas chutz. The only reason why it's excluded is because of name Mishkan Hashem, because the sexual sin happened after it was already roy. Ella muktzah v'nevad, but let's say it was an animal that was an idolatrous animal. It was worshipped or set aside. Ain't on the most you can't say that the idolatry happened after it was already consecrated. So it had to have happened before it was consecrated, because once it's consecrated, you can't worship it, because we have a concept a person cannot prohibit something that doesn't belong to him. And so therefore we have to say that it was consecrated, it was worshipped, and so before it was consecrated, and when it was worshipped, it was right before it. So why are we citing the verse of name Mishkan Hashem? So the Gemara says, no, we are talking about a case that was already consecrated. So the Gemara says, Bekachim Kalam. No, we're talking about a case where he worshipped it after it was already consecrated. So it was Roy Lavo, but it was being excluded because of the name Mishkan Hashem. And what's his case? We're talking about a case of Kachim Kalam, where it was a lesser sacred offering, where you brought your own personal korban shlamim. And Aliba the Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says Kachim Kalam Mamam Bailam, who he says this Kachim Kalam is money of a specific, is money that the person owns. The Tanyu Moa Malba Hashem by Asham Hilo Rabbas Kachim Kalam. That we see that Kachim Kalam is included to be a person's personal money. Shem and Mono Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So therefore, let's summarize. Rovea v'nirva devar erva. Rovea navir, the sexual sin. We're talking about a case where the sexual sin was committed after it was already consecrated, and so therefore we're going to say it's even though it was roy, it's excluded from Lifnei Mishkan Hashem. Muktzah v'nevad, again, it was kachik kalam, and so it's excluded Lifnei. It was roy, but it was excluded because of Mishkan Hashem. So muktzah v'nevad. So therefore we're going to say avodas kalam b'kachim kalam. What about esnan and mochir koayim yotzi dofen? And what about the next category is listed in the Mishnah? The case of Esnan, where it was exchanged for a harlot, or Mechir exchanged for a dog, or Kalayim, or if it was offspring of two different species, or if it's a cesarean section. What's the scenario there? Why don't we say there that it was excluded because of that it was not capable of being brought to the altar? Clearly, when it's born, it's not capable. So the Gemara says, no, we're talking about a case bivlados kachim, that it was first kodesh. It was the offspring of kachim, so therefore it was first sacred. So it was capable of being brought, and then it was born. And kasavar, and this must be at the position, vladei kachim ba'avayasan hein kedoshim. That at the moment that they're created, they're already holy. So they were capable of being brought to the temple. And then we're going to have to say that the reason why they can't be brought is because of Lifnei Mishkan Hashem. Okay, the next category, the next part of the Mishnah says that if it would be something that it was a fixed blemish, or if it's a passing blemish, it's prohibited, it's excluded from the prohibition of kares. even though later on it would be capable of being brought, since at that moment it's not capable. And then Mishnah gave a couple of examples of circumstances where right now it's not capable, but even though later on it would be capable of being brought, it's still excluded from the kares penalty. Whereas Reb Shimon argues and says, even though it's excluded from kares, there's still a lav, there's still just a regular prohibition. So why do we need all these cases that the Mishnah lists? The Mishnah listed balei mumin that are passing, and it also listed the case of the doves that are not yet old enough, that eventually they'll be old enough. But if you take a dove that was consecrated, it's not yet old enough, and you slaughter it outside, the Talmud Talmud says you're excluded. And also the case of oso v'espino. Two animals an animal can't be slaughtered with its offspring on the same day. And if you did it, then you're in violation of the prohibition. So therefore, it's not roy at that point, but later on it will be roy. So still, you're excluded from kares. So the Gemara says, why do we need all these cases? Because if we just had the case of the animal that has a temporary blemish, and we say at that moment it's not roy, so therefore it's excluded, we would say therefore mishum dema'isi, it's repulsive. Although torin, but the animal that did not yet reach its age where it's able to be brought, I would say the reason I would say Torin, the Loma'isi, which is not repulsive yet. It's not repulsive. Ema de Module, Rabbi Shimon. I might have thought that the Tanakh would agree with Rabbi Shimon that there is a prohibition, even though you don't get kares, there's a prohibition if you slaughter outside the temple. Mitana Torin, and if it just had the case of the baby doves, I would say Misham Duo Chazi, the Itchu, because in a certain sense it's not as bad because it was never appropriate and then got pushed off. We've said this concept several times in our tractate that it's worse for it to be one time capable and then pushed off rather than never being capable of a balei mumin the ichsu v'itchu. But a case of an animal with a blemish where it was at one point worthy to be brought and then it got pushed away, I might think that the rabbis would agree with Rabbi Shimon that it's prohibition, even though it's not kares. In model Rabbi Shimon or Rabbi Ema the model of a balei mumin the ichsu ve'itchu ema the modelahu Rabbi Shimon or Rabbanan. I might think, well, actually they say it the opposite way. I might think under those circumstances that Rabbi Shimon would admit the rabbi that if it's slaughtered, you're not going to be in violation of the prohibition because the balei mumin were ichsu ve'itchu. But then the Gemara says the opposite logic. Vitani ayin etarti. And if we had these two prohibitions, I would say mishum psula de gufayu, because there is an inherent defect in the animal itself. Of oso ve'espino, the psula me'alma ka'asila. This is just an external prohibition, meaning to say you could just wait a day. So it's external. It's not something that's inherent in the animal. Maybe the rabbis would agree with Rabbi Shimon that there is a prohibition on it. Sricha. It's also possible to read it the other way. You might have thought that the Rabbi Shimon would admit to the rabbis in that case. That's Tosfos's girsa, because you could do this logic, the same logic either way. Okay, so now we say Rabbi Shimon says that it's in these cases where it will be, right now it's not capable of being brought, but it will be if you wait an amount of time, it will be capable of being brought. Rabbi Shimon says, yes, it's not kares, but it is still a regular prohibition if you slaughter it outside. So outside of the temple area. So the Gemara says, my time to Rabbi Shimon. What's the basis for Rabbi Shimon? Why does he say there's a prohibition? So the Gemara says, I'm a Rabbi Ila'a, I'm a Reish Lakish, the Amar Kra, because based upon the verse that says, Lo ta'asun kechol asher anachnu osim po hayom. The pasuk says that Moshe says, when you come into the land of Israel, you're not allowed to do like everything we do today. What do we do today? Everybody does that. Everybody does right in their own eyes. So it says you can't do it. So Amru Moshe, so that's a prohibition. Amru Moshe Yisrael, ki Lisu Eretz Yisrael. What Moshe was saying to Bnei Yisrael, when you go up to the land of Israel, Yashrus takrivu, chovos lo takrivu. It calls Yashrus. Yashrus is whatever is Yashar. That that everybody could do yashrus. The yashrus refers to the voluntary vows that a person brings. Nidarim and davos, that you'll have to bring them in a communal offering. So when you go into the land of Israel, you can't just do your own voluntary offerings. He says, Moshe Rabbeinu was saying to the Jewish people, Yashrus takrivu, when you go into the land of Israel, you could bring the Yashrus, you could bring the voluntary offerings, but the Chovos wo takrivu. But Moshe Rabbeinu was saying that the voluntary offerings, those you could bring on your bama, but the obligatory offerings, those you can't even bring on the communal bama. You have to wait for the Mishkan to be established. Meaning to say, right when you come in, you were in the Bnei Yisrael in the place called Gilgal, and then they were eventually going to get to the place called Shiloh. So in Gilgal, they were allowed to bring the voluntary offerings in the Bamas Tzibor. In Gilgal, they could bring it, not in a private offering. And then in Shiloh, they could also bring the obligatory offerings, the chatos and the asham. So we see from here, so Moshe is saying when you come into the land of Israel, bring the voluntary offerings, but not the obligatory offerings until you get to Shiloh. The Gilgal agabe Shiloh, and Gilgal with respect to Shiloh, it was Mechusar Zman because they could have just waited. It took 14 years till they set it up in Shiloh. The Carmel of Moshe lo tasun, and Moshe calls it a prohibition. Do not do it. So we see from here that even though eventually it would be something that since eventually it will be something that will be permitted, it's considered to be a prohibition. And so that's the source. That since eventually it will be something that's permitted, it's called a prohibition. So I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Zera, if that's the case, if that's the basis for this, milky nami lilki, then why doesn't, according to Rabbi Shimon, you should also get lashes. So Alama Amar Rabbi Zera, why did Rabbi Zera say, because of nitko say, the pasuk turned this into a positive commandment and says, that the pasuk turns it into Bayom Hashmini Tinuin. The pasuk turned it into a positive commandment, and so it's not it's not lashes. So the Gemara says, well, no. Rabbi Zera was saying that Hanamilu Rabbanon. When he was saying, according to the Rabbanon, it became a positive commandment and not a negative commandment. But according to Rabbi Shimon, you would get lashes. But with Rabbi Shimon, Hachinami, Rabbi Shimon would say you get lashes. So the first source, based upon Rabbi Zera, is that the pasuk says, Lo tasun kain Hashem, Lo tasun kachol asher nachnu osim poayom. That's the source that Rabbi Ilah says. So now the Gemara says a second possibility, what's the source for Rabbi Shimon's prohibition, is Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Panim de Gilgal gabe Shiloh kechutz dami. That even though you're at Gilgal, meaning to say the pasuk says lo ta'asun, which prohibits you to bring at Gilgal these obligatory offerings, and since the place where they're really supposed to be brought is Shiloh, it's going to be considered. So this is not a new answer as to the source of Rabbi Shimon. This is explaining the question of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Remember, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, "Why don't you get lashes?" And so the answer that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says is because the panim de Gilgal is like the chutz of Shiloh, meaning to say the pasuk that says you cannot bring it by Gilgal is because the proper place is in Shiloh, and so therefore, if you bring it in Gilgal, it's as though you brought it outside of Gilgal outside as Shiloh before their proper time. And so therefore, it's referring to something that you brought outside the proper time, before the proper time outside, but not before the proper time inside. And so therefore, Rabbi Shimon says you don't get lashes for it. But if you slaughter a carbon that's missing the proper time outside, you would get lashes because that's what the pasuk is referring to. Meaning to say it's like you slaughtered it. Look at the language of the text. It says he's saying panim de Gilgal legabe Shiloh kechutz dami. Meaning to say vis-a-vis Shiloh, it's like chutz, but it was really panim. Okay, Rabbi Bar Amar Taimei the Rabbi Shimon. A different answer is the answer of Rabba. What's the source of Rabbi Shimon that you don't get lashes? And that is based upon So the next answer is from Rabba. Rabba says the timing to Rabbi Shimon is good to Tanya. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Minayla Zoveach Pesach Bebamas Yachid Beshas Isra Bamos Shubu Osase. So again, what's the reason? Hold on one second. What's the reason that Rabbi Shimon says you don't get lashes? What's the reason why? What's the source for the prohibition for if you slaughter a korban outside the Beis Hamikdash? That's Mechusar Man, that there's a prohibition according to Rabbi Shimon. And he says based upon the fact that we learned in the price. Rabbi Shimon says, Minayla Zoveach Pesach Bebamas Yachid. How do I know if you slaughter a korban Pesach on your own individual offering, on your own individual altar, Bishas Isra Bamos, at a time when the Bamos were prohibited, Shehu B'Osasi, that you're in violation of a prohibition. That you're not allowed to slaughter the Pesach wherever you want. I might think even during the time where bamos were allowed, you'll be in violation of that. You're not allowed to bring the Karm Pesach even in your own individual. That if you bring your korban Pesach at that time, you're in violation of the prohibition. So the Gemara says, "Tamor b'achad sharecha lo amarti." I only told you not to bring the korban Pesach on your own private offering. B'shah shekol Yisrael nechnasim b'shar echad. Only at a time when everybody brings it together. But when everybody's not doing it together, when everybody's not doing it together, then you can bring it in your own private bama. Then that's not what the pasuk is referring to, and so that there's no prohibition about that. The Gemara says, but Amos, when is the verse referring to? When do we say on the 14th day of Nisan that there is a prohibition of slaughtering the Pesach on your own individual offering, when the altar, when the bamos are prohibited? Inema achar chatzos, if when it's just a prohibition. Do we say it's after chatzos? Karis nami mechayev. Well, if it's after chatzos, then the Pesach is supposed to be brought, and so then you're taking an animal which was appropriate to be brought, and you bring it outside the temple. That it should be karis. Elav kodem chatzos. So we see that you're slaughtering it. When is there the prohibition of slaughtering the korban Pesach? So it must be prior to chatzos, even though later on it will become a total prohibition. Right now, it's just mechusar zman, and yet we say that there's a prohibition. So that's the source of Rabbi Shimon, who's saying that by kodshim that are mechusar zman, that you're in violation of prohibition. The Gemara says no. No, it could be that the price is referring to if you saw the Pesach after chatos. But what are we talking about? B'shas heder bamos kain. And the pasuk is referring to a time when actually the bamos were allowed to be brought. Meaning to say, even then, there's a prohibition to bring your own private Pesach in your own backyard, even though other offerings are allowed to bring. You can't bring your Pesach. Gemara says, but the Brisa says specifically that we're talking about the Peshas Isra Abamos at the time of the prohibition. The Gemara says, no, what that means is Isra Bama Lo Heter Bamos L'Chavero. It's a prohibition to do your own private offering when it is an obligatory offering. But for the voluntary offerings, you would be allowed to do your own private offering. Okay, so then we say, at Gilgal, only Gilgal. You couldn't bring the chatos and the asham, but you could bring the Pesach. You couldn't bring the chatas and the asham. Okay. And that's how the Rambam rules. The Rambam rules seems to be like a machokas amongst the Rishonim, but the Rambam rules for halacha, like this position of the Gemara, that if you slaughtered the Pesach during the time where the individual bamas were allowed, and if you slaughtered on your own private bama, you get lashes. That because the Pesach, even though you're allowed to bring your own private offerings to cover Pesach, national significance, it had to be brought in the communal place. So we learned in the Mishnah what's considered to be a Mechuser's man on account of its owner. These are the sacrifices of the Zava, and the Yoledes, that before they were able to bring the offering, because they were called Mechuser Kippurim. So if they brought their Chatas and their Asham outside before their time, they're exempt from Kares because they are not able to be brought at that point. The Gemara says, "V'hani b'nei Asham masnenu." They don't bring an Asham. The Zav, and the Yoledet, they don't bring an Asham. Why does it say they're Asham? So the Gemara says, "Amar Ziri Tani Mitzora Badayah." The Mitzora does bring an Asham, so you have to add the Mitzora. The Gemara says, "V'hani b'nei Shlam," and also it says, "Oh, same Mishlam Me'en." V'hani b'nei Shlamim Nenu. They don't bring a Shlam in this category of people. Amar Sheshes Tani Nazir, including Nazir. Is the Iri Kavua tonight? The Mishnah actually does say his approach was included in the Mishnah, i.e. in Mitzora. The Rav Sheshes lo kavua tonight. Rav Sheshes' approach was not included. Okay. So, okay, that's today's daf. We'll stop here. Baruch Hashem, we'll pick this up, God willing, at 8 o'clock we'll review, and then tonight.